this works. It is disconcerting to hear your voice in the sound system. Right. So, good morning. And thank you for joining us for this discussion on the opportunities and challenges of removals in compliance markets. My name is Stefanie Laus-Toya. I'm a senior expert at ICAP. And I am joined today by amazing speakers, starting from my right. So we have Mark Sipola, who's the Chief of Climate Change Program Evaluation Branch in the California Air Resources Board. He basically runs the California Cap and Trade Program. We have Oliver Hendrickson, the Counselor for Agriculture in the New Zealand Mission to the EU. We have Helen Bray, who's the Vice President of Policy at Puro Earth. And here on my right, we have Felix Gray, who is the head of ETS greenhouse gas removal policy at the UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. And before I hand it over to our distinguished panel, I would like to kick us off with a quick overview on the 4 ways in which emission trading systems, which is what we will focus on today, 4 ways in which emission trading systems may interact or not with removal units. So let us imagine these 2 elements. We have a market for removals where a government issues allowances that are used by regulated entities towards compliance obligations in the ETS. And then we have a market for removals where negative emission technologies, or CDR suppliers, generate removal units that are sold to governments, to private entities, to citizens for their own purposes. So we have these 2 markets. In a first model on the interaction between emission trading systems and removals, these 2 are disconnected, right? So this means that no removal units enter the emission trading system. It doesn't mean that the ETS can't be used to indirectly support CDR development, for example, through the use of auction revenues, but no removal units enter the ETS. What does this mean? This means that the incentive for abatement and removal is kept separate. And this has the advantage that there is no risk of undermining the incentive for abatement inside the ETS because of a hope or an expectation of having very cheap removal units in the future. There's also no risk of undermining the integrity of the ETS through low-quality removal units. But this comes at a cost. There can be a risk of reduced economic welfare if removals, high-quality removals, end up being cheaper than abatement inside the ETS. And we, in that situation, cannot use removal units as an instrument of price or cost control inside the ETS, right? And the ETS would also not be a source of demand for removal units. So that's the first model. In a second model, these 2 markets are connected through the government. So the government goes to the market for removals, buys units, and inserts them into the ETS. So this is controlled by the government, and it can be done by replacing conventional allowances with removal units or through reserves for cost containment, for example. If you're following the literature and you've heard of a European carbon central bank, this is the type of stuff they're talking about, right? So in this situation, we have an advantage of a reduced risk of those economic welfare losses, because now you have removals inside of the ETS. If removals are cheaper than abatement inside of the ETS, you can use it as an instrument for cost containment. And the ETS starts providing direct support to CDR deployment, which can be complemented by government support to that CDR if the cost of removals is higher than the cost of abatement. Am I making sense? Right. However, here we start seeing a situation where regulated entities inside of the ETS look at this and go, removals are inside. What is going to happen in the future? What is going to be the cost of these removals? Is there going to be more removals in the future? Does it make sense for me to invest less in abatement because maybe the price in the ETS will be much lower in the future? You introduce this uncertainty, and this can lead to reduced incentive for abatement inside of the ETS, which can be real or perceived, but is nevertheless having an impact potentially on the market price. A third option is to connect these 2 markets with restrictions. So if you see an ETS today that uses carbon credits, this is more or less how it looks like, right? So regulated entities can buy removal units directly from providers of CDR, but there are restrictions on quantity and quality. So here, again, we have the issue of reduced risk of welfare losses if removals are cheaper than abatement. There's a potential for the use of removal units as an instrument of price control. There's more support to CDR deployment, albeit only if the price is right. Because if removals are more expensive than abatement, then this transaction will not happen unless there is some type of complementary system, like a carbon contract for difference, to bridge that gap, right? And here, we would expect a higher risk of reduced incentive for abatement inside of the ETS because of a perceived more open connection between these two markets. Then finally, we have fully integrated markets. So what is this? The negative emission technologies, they can still sell to whoever and whomever they want, but when it comes to the ETS, there is no limit on the volume of removal units that can be used inside of the ETS. This, in theory, can deliver the most economically efficient allocation of abatement and removal, but this comes at a cost, which is a cost of loss of control by the government of decarbonization pathways, of the balance between abatements and removals. And this may not be something that is desirable, or it may be desirable, societally speaking. This can also bring a higher risk of high carbon lock-in, especially if there's an expectation that removals will be cheaper and cheaper in the future. Right, so these are the four models, and we will talk about them a bit more today. If you're interested, this is a paper, this is a link, this is something that you can download from here, or go to the ICAP booth, and we have a hard copy for you there as well. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to our panel, and I would like to start with Mark. Let me see if I can go back to this one. Mark, the Californian Cap and Trade program already uses removal units, primarily through the connected with restrictions, right? A limited number of credits from forestry. Tell us a bit about how the experience has been, and do you envisage this setup changing as California starts approaching net zero emissions?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for the invitation to speak here. Again, I'm overseeing the California Cap and Trade program. Part of that program is a compliance offset program, and it does fall, I would say, in the lower left panel here, option 3, with the connected with restrictions, where essentially, to an extent, the compliance credits are fungible with allowances. So they're all, they can be used for compliance within the system. We have currently the compliance offset program encourages projects that are outside of covered sectors by the program to reduce emissions when they follow specific board-adopted protocols. We have 6 of those protocols. One is forestry, which would relate to removals from the atmosphere. There's others related to destroying refrigerants or ozone-depleting substances and capturing methane from mines and from dairy operations. Those are more emission reductions, but they are equivalent within our program. Again, these are projects that follow very strict rules. They're verified by third parties. They're reviewed by registries like CAR and ACR and VERA. They're also reviewed by staff at the California Air Resources Board to ensure their integrity. And I will note that there are 6 of these protocols. Only 4 of them are being used, and that may speak to this cost differential that you're pointing to, where we've got a protocol related to rice cultivation and related to urban forests that we haven't seen any projects in, at least at our current allowance prices, which have historically been in the range $20 currently, or up to $40, currently around $35. So there are usage limits associated with these compliance credits. An entity that's in the program can only use right now up to 4% offset credits for compliance with their obligations. Historically, that's been 8%. Our program's been in existence since 2013. So 2013 through 2020, 8% of an emissions obligation could be met with offset credits. After 2020, it's now 4%. It's going up to 6% later this decade. Those are some political compromise discussions, but that's how that's playing out. I have a few, and then there's one other element after 2020 that has been incorporated into the compliance offset program, and those are credits that provide direct environmental benefits to California, essentially those located in California that provide direct air quality benefits or direct water quality benefits. And so the current program design, that usage limit, that 4%, only up to 2% can be met by credits. So half of that usage limit, currently 2%, can be met by credits that do not provide direct environmental benefits to the state. So there's several bifurcations in the market on the quality of the credits. I do have a few stats on how the program, the history of the program. We've issued 262 million credits since 2013. 80% of those have been the forest-related credits. About 10% have been related to destroying ozone-depleting substances, 6% destroying mine methane, and another 4% destroying dairy methane. What we've found, so the only data we have are for the first 3 compliance periods from 2013 through 2020. We saw increasing use, so during that time, the usage limit was at 8%. The first compliance period, we saw offsets used at about 4%. In the second compliance period, we saw usage around 6.4%, and in the third compliance period, 7%. So increasing usage generally, and all of this information I'll point out is available on our webpage. I'm just outlining some public data, so at the California Air Resources Board cap and trade page. And what we generally see are the largest entities, those with the biggest obligations, are those that are maxing out their credit usage at 8%. And then smaller entities where there's more friction in terms of participating in the market, maybe they don't have the capacity to shop around for credits, they're typically not using credits, or they are using a smaller amount. The prices that we've seen on the market back before 2020, before we had the criteria for direct environmental benefits to the state, they were selling at about a 20 to 30% discount. Now we've got this bifurcated market where we've got direct environmental benefits credits, and which I call DEBS credits, and non-DEBS credits. And we see the non-DEBS credits selling for around a 50% discount. So on the market now, $16 to $18 if the allowance price is $35. And the DEBS credits selling around $29 to $31. So a much smaller discount for those credits. And I'll also just note with the removals, there's always, we review all of the credits that that we allow for compliance for being real, being measurable, quantifiable, verifiable, additional, and permanent. And that permanence piece, when we're talking about sequestration, we have a 100-year permanence standard, And to ensure that integrity, each time with a forest credit, when credits are issued to a project for sequestering carbon in the trees, about 10 to 20% is set aside in a buffer pool, which serves as an insurance mechanism that can be drawn upon in the case of a wildfire destroying the trees, or pests, or any other unintentional cause of reversing that storage back into the atmosphere. If there are intentional reversals, such as abandoning the project, the requirement in the program is for the project to restore the credits themselves, not via the buffer pool insurance mechanism. So I'll be happy to follow through on those elements. Encourage you to tune into our webpage if you want more information there, and I'll turn it over to the next panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I'm going to pass it on to Felix, who's been very, very busy at the UK ETS Authority consulting on the potential inclusion of removal units in the UK ETS. Can you tell us a little bit about what options you're considering and what you've learned with the consultation process so far, which I think ended in recent days?
Yes, it ended halfway through August. Yeah, so very happy to do that. As Stephanie said, we put out a consultation primarily aimed at engineered removals, which we call GGRs in the UK. I'll try and say CFD, but if I slip, apologies. So I'll start just with a little bit of policy context in terms of the wider policy landscape, because that's important in terms of thinking about the four options. So we're doing lots in the UK to try and support CDR, and alongside ETS, really the other big policy move is what we call business models, which are essentially carbon contracts for difference to support early deployment. So as we all know, CDR is an immature technology, and we're going to need to support its early deployment. So the crucial thing for ETS is that in the UK, we have a different policy outside the ETS doing that. That then means for ETS integration, really the core purpose is to provide demand in the longer run. So the core thing with the removals is they are a public good. You're going to see the standard market failure there of not enough demand. And we think that what the ETS can do is solve that market failure by providing lots of demand. Just in terms of quantities, which Stephanie also mentioned people might like to hear, we don't have any legislated targets for CDR in the UK, but we do have ambitions. And our ambitions are, if anyone's interested, 5 megatons in 2030, 23 megatons in 2035, and then potentially 75 to 81 megatons by 2050. So not targets, but some ambitions there. In terms of how we want to try and do potential CDR integration into the UK ETS, we think it's important to stick to at least 3 key principles. Luckily, Stephanie's made my job easier by actually mentioning them all already. But just to reiterate, abatement deterrence. We need to do this in a way where removals don't lead to more emissions. So that's a really key thing, priority for us. Another one is ETS stability. We don't want to do anything that messes up the UK ETS. And a final thing is that point about efficient markets in the long run. The long run objective here is to get to a point where the marginal cost of removals is equal to the marginal cost of abatement in one big market. And then the theory there is that you're going to get a really efficient outcome as long as you've dealt with the other market failures. So those 2 things are obviously, those 3 things are sometimes a bit in tension, but it's those that we're trying to achieve. In terms of policy positions, there's lots of detail in the consultation, which I would encourage everyone to read and get in touch with us if you have views. But I can just talk mainly about really how we fit into Stephanie's helpful grid and what that means for the cap, basically. This is an ETS policy, so what we do on the cap is really, really important. And what we propose in the consultation is what we call a policy to maintain the cap. So when you issue an allowance to a CDR operator who's removed a ton of carbon, we think that the ETS authority should auction one less allowance, so a kind of one in, one out approach, which effectively means that your policy of integrating CDR hasn't impacted your ETS cap. And if you haven't changed the cap with your CDR, then you obviously are not allowing people to pollute more. So it really knocks out the abatement deterrence thing, we think. I know there is some subtlety there, and get in touch if you disagree. But we think it's a very strong step towards ensuring you don't get abatement deterrence. It also, obviously, maintaining your ETS cap goes a very long way to maintaining your ETS market stability. So we think that basically this cap option, which we have a minded to position for at least initial integration, achieves a lot in terms of the safeguards of abatement deterrence and ETS stability. And crucially, what that allows you to do is it allows you to have a simpler market structure elsewhere in the policy package. So it allows us, we think, to go straight to that kind of bottom right option in Stephanie's grid. So the kind of very simple market structure where you just have full integration. You're not placing extra limits on how people can use the credits. This is obviously really good for CDR developers because they're very simply integrated into a relatively simple market. And the other thing to mention here is to come back to this point about carbon contracts for difference. So one of the things we're not trying to do here is use the ETS for essentially technology policy for an early technology. It's the carbon contracts for difference that will do that. So we don't think that some of those other models, that the carbon central bank versions, which are partly about providing support to early and expensive technologies, we don't think we need to do that through the ETS if you have a separate policy outside the ETS doing that. I've probably run out of time. I could talk about other bits in our consultation, but I could also leave it there.
I think we can get to those during the questions. Thank you. Thank you, Felix. And it's really interesting to hear that integrated market is where you're planning to go, because this is what New Zealand has done, right? And so, Oliver, the New Zealand ETS so far is the only ETS that is fully integrated with removals, in this case from forestry. Can you tell us Can you tell us a little bit about how it has worked and what lessons you have from the last 16 years
16, yep.
that you've been operating?
Thank you, Stephanie. And can you hear me okay? Yep, good. There it is. Yeah, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. In my previous role, actually, before becoming the Councillor for Agriculture, I was the regulator for New Zealand's forestry ETS for the last 8 years. So I have a few opinions and a few scars on my back to play. So in the New Zealand ETS, there's really three entities that kind of make the market work. You have the government, which is the regulator of the provision of units and provides education to participants and carries out compliance and enforcement. You then have the emitting section of the economy, which has a legislative requirement to surrender X percentage of units every year. And then you have the sequestering part of the economy, of the ETS, which is, in our case, the foresters. So we verify the emission returns that come from forestry companies, that the trees are where they say they are of that age, and the entitlements are correct, and we take corrective action if not. What the monetization of those carbon credits, where 1 ton equals 1 NZU, occurs on the private market, where emitters and foresters reach contractual arrangements around the price, and the price sits at around $62 a ton today, which is roughly about 30 some odd euros. And you see the movement of NZUs from emitters to the forestry company. And over the last 5 years, we've seen about 70 million NZUs move from foresters into emitters, and we've seen about just over $1 billion in revenue move from emitters into foresters and landowners. And you're seeing a lot of banks being able to use it as collateral and also in forward sale contracts. So rather than just pay as you go, as emitters are taking a very long-term view as to their requirements and being able to form long-term arrangements, which provides certainty for both parties. Getting into a little bit of the detail, one thing that I think is often forgotten but is really important. if you go back to why we have the rules like we do, it goes back to Kyoto, and you may recall, and we won't torture anyone on Kyoto, but you go back to like pre-90 and P89, the Division of Forestry accounting rules there. And where our ETS is also really effective is preventing deforestation. So we have two types of forests in our ETS. We have forests that were established before 1990, and that's for New Zealand, that's about 2 million hectares of exotic pine forest. Those forests are not entitled to earn carbon credits, but if they deforest, they'll be required to pay back units to the Crown of up to $60,000 per hectare, and penalties if it hasn't been done in a legal way. So that is a locked-in land use that New Zealand keeps as a baseline for its carbon accounting. And then for forests at post-89, this is where landowners can voluntarily, now I'll just use the word voluntary just a little bit here, this is about voluntarily joining the compliance market. So you make a commercial decision whether forestry is right for you, and you can join the ETS and be in the ability to earn carbon credits. Kind of the rules of the game roughly are you have to provide at least 1 hectare of land, it has to be a tree species that can reach 5 meters, and you have to have at least 30% canopy cover. And you provide your emissions returns at a minimum once every 5 years, which does an accounting true up as to if you've done any harvesting or your growth, you get entitlements or surrender requirements, and you get your allocation. Or if you wish to engage more annually, you can provide an annual return, which does exactly the same thing, and you still do the true up once every 5 years. Interestingly, though, there's a lot of lessons coming from 2008 and what we assumed would happen with our ETS, which was assumptions that only about 150 large forestry companies would actually wish to join the ETS, and most of them would be more than 100 hectares in participation. And fast forward about 10 years from 2008, and we found ourselves with over 2,000 participants. And 80% of them have less than 50 hectares. They're actually small landowners who are diversifying their land and using forestry to optimize their land use. So if they have some pasture that doesn't actually produce very good stocking units, they can actually plant some trees and have some income that comes and also help stabilize land as well. So interestingly, we built a system that was designed for mega forest companies, and we did get them, but we had to embark on a review in 2015 when we realized we were actually getting growing demand from a smaller landowner segment, and we had to change our accounting rules from being very precise, strict, kind of following carbon curves up to harvest and then full surrender and continuing that trend. We aligned with our international accounting rules, which is for averaging accounting, and we moved to an averaging accounting approach, which at the end of the day, why was that good for our landowners and our small participants, was because it actually provided the ability for people to trade carbon credits, because in the New Zealand ETS, you can earn carbon credits as your forests grow, but if you harvest them, you surrender them completely. So at this, as long as the rules are now, if you effectively keep your land in forest cover, and you do some harvesting, you are able to keep at least the average carbon stock of the life of that forest. So it provides more fungible units that can flow into the unit and provides more incentives to plant more trees. The results of this has been that in the last 4 years, we've doubled the size of our post-89 forest from 300,000 hectares to over 600,000 hectares, and we've doubled our participant base for post-89 foresters from about 2,000 to just over 4,000 right now. It has taken a whole rethink on a regulatory approach, working with smaller landowners, and that's perhaps something we could get into in the questions. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you for this. Oliver, Helen, Puro Earth certifies carbon removal. So speaking from the supply side, because we've been hearing very much about the regulation of the demand side, right? So you can speak from the supply side. What do CDR providers need in order to deliver carbon dioxide removal that is cost effective and has environmental integrity?
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for all the work that you do and the paper that you've been showing us today. I've used it many times for brainstorming sessions and to discuss how things work. And if I'll just spend 30 seconds on what is Puro Earth in case people aren't aware. We're a global carbon crediting platform for durable carbon removals, and we certify projects all around the world, so every continent of the world apart from Antarctica. We have 5 methodologies to deliver the net zero emissions: biochar, enhanced weathering, terrestrial storage of biomass, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, direct air capture and storage, and carbonated materials. And we have three pillars to the work that we do. We have scientists who write the protocols, as we've been discussing protocols. We certify the projects working with independent verifiers. We issue the carbon credits. And that is all published in our registry. So the issuance to then the retirement. This will all sound very familiar to you. So your question was, what do CO2 removal suppliers need to make that business case for investment? And we tend to look at policies from the 3 Cs, so certification, compliance, and claims. So CDR suppliers, they need to scale this decade. They need governments to give them clear regulatory oversight on what is high-quality carbon dioxide removal. We have the EU with its carbon removal, carbon farming framework. We have the UK talking about standards. You talked about the standards that you have under both your schemes as well. So please, government, set that high quality. And we need, what projects need is they need compliance markets to signal demand. But as we've often talked about, the prices in compliance markets aren't yet quite high enough for the prices for the types of methods that we certify. We have a biochar price index, and that's currently about €125 a tonne. So this is much higher than the compliance market prices we're seeing. So that's why, and we heard a bit about business models from the UK, we often call for time-limited technology support because we don't have that price signal from the compliance markets. We don't just look at compliance markets, we are a voluntary carbon market player. We're doing our Corsair application for the carbon offsetting reduction scheme for international aviation. This is where voluntary carbon markets get access into compliance markets. It all starts to become and coalesce together. And we often ask governments to set clear frameworks around how credits can be used in environmental claims, and we can maybe talk about that another time. So I think, everything that we've been doing now, we've been operational for about 5 years. The volume of credits we issued is around the 500,000 mark. You can see the volumes were a lot lower than what we've been hearing about from other panelists and the markets that they're working with. But what's really important is we ask governments to partner with the voluntary carbon market, use the existing market infrastructure that we've built, set clear, high standard regulations, and then we can have swift and robust implementation. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Helen. And thank you all for the conversation so far. I want to take questions from the audience. Questions, comments, concerns? Please, Alexander. The gentleman here at the front.
Good morning. My name is Alexander. I'm with I4C. It's a part of the World Bank Group. Thank you for this discussion. My question is about the volume of, or the role of offsets in the road to net zero. So I'll use the analogy of private companies. A lot of them set up net zero ambitions, there used to be, well, there's still a criticism that some heavy polluters can buy their way out of climate change by buying cheap removals well, mainly in voluntary carbon markets. Some organizations like SBTI, Science Based Targets Initiative, they came up with I would say it's a guidance, which basically says you can only offset maybe up to 5–10% of your emissions. And first, you have to do direct reductions of your emissions. So if I understood Mark correctly, in the California ETS, you only allow 8% of the emissions to be offset by removals, and it's gradually going down. And I think, Felix, you mentioned you have UK has the megatons ambitions. Can you comment on how or what percentage would that correspond to? Thank you.
Maybe we take a few questions and then we respond them in one go. The lady here.
Thank you for the panel, and really great to hear the real-time cases. And we talked about New Zealand's flagship case of the fully integrated markets regarding removals. But when we look at removals, it's the forestry and nature projects, but we also see engineered projects. I can ask this question in two ways. So either was there a reason why the engineered removals was not part of the scope for the integration to compliance, or the other way of asking this question is, do you have any plans in the mid or long run to integrate engineered removals as well? Thank you.
I suppose that question is to California because they cover primarily forests.
And I think New Zealand as well.
Uh-huh.
Sure.
Yeah. And would be great to hear from California as well.
Thank you. The gentleman here, and then I'll take two more. Andres there, and the gentleman here on the right.
Thank you. It's a very practical question. What kind of removals can be used in the different markets? Because I think that we have two dimensions. One is about the technology, about how you, and the other thing is where those projects are related to. For example, in California or in New Zealand, you can provide these kind of removals from outside of your country, or is only related to the locals? Thank you.
Thank you. You can maybe pass the microphone. Exactly. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Really interesting panel. So I have a question. So Mark mentioned a bit the permanence issue and how to tackle like uncertainty in forest. I just wonder if beyond forest, like how, like what are your thoughts, or like what is happening in the future in regulating this permanence issue and the uncertainty around it in the other types of removals that Helen mentioned? I know it's quite difficult to think of this from the regulator side, but it's a bit connected to my previous two colleagues and their questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And the gentleman here all the way to my right, if you can pass the microphone. Here at the front.
Okay, thank you very much. Kari Hämeenkoski from Nordic Environment. We had a meeting with the several Nordic government president people knowing the markets really well, and there's major interest in Nordics in removals, but everyone was asking more clarity, especially from EU Commission. I mean, more clarity, rules are unclear, so if you can maybe address, especially from EU side, the needed regulation for removals. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So the questions I have are, on the role of offsets to net zero in an emission trading system, comments on what makes sense in terms of the quantity of removal units that go into the ETS. A couple of questions on benefits and disbenefits of engineered versus nature-based. Also from where, domestic versus international. How to regulate permanence within and beyond forest removal types, and finally, Helen, if you can take the one on European policy making, otherwise I can do that. So, any takers? Shall we start with you? What do you make of it?
So some really good questions. In reverse order, permanence. We have thought a lot about permanence. Because while we're committed to engineered GGRs in the UK ETS, we are exploring woodland GGRs or forest GGRs, which we haven't made a decision on, but we're thinking about it. And really the huge objection that people raise to woodland is permanence. So in the course of thinking about woodland in the UK ETS, we've thought a lot about permanence. We have lots of proposals or ideas in the consultation. And we basically think that there is no single policy that's going to sort it out, but you're going to want to combine different levers together into some kind of permanence framework. And we propose three different things. There's a question about how sort of stringent you make them. But this is always going to be, if you're thinking about the permanence of things like forest or products or whatever, there is going to be risk in carbon stored in that way. So it's a really tricky problem to manage. We've had a go at trying to think about it. The question about what kinds of removals and where. So for the UK ETS, it's engineered. in the form of direct air carbon capture and storage and bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And it's maybe woodland, as I mentioned. We need to work out what we think about that. And in terms of location, for initial integration at least, it's UK only. So there is a question about, should you be having removals that have taken place abroad? But for the UK, at least initially, we have a -2 position that it's UK only. Final question that I'll try and answer, quantities of CDR in the UK ETS. So no kind of decisions have been made about where those total UK government ambitions that I mentioned, how they would be met. It won't all be ETS for sure. We're hoping that the voluntary markets can deliver as much as possible. If you took the entire quantities that I mentioned and look at those in relation to where the cap for the ETS might be, which is only legislated out to 2030, then it starts off as a small proportion, maybe say 10%, of which not all will go into the ETS. So it starts small, but then given the ambitions, it gets very big quite quickly. So that's how the quantities kind of compare.
Shall I then just go towards the right? Helen, you want to comment on the question?
Yeah, I make comments on SBTI and the EU. So thank you for your question around use of offsets on the way to net zero. So it's very important that, yes, we just focus on durable carbon removal, but accelerated emissions reductions are needed on that pathway to net zero. And it's all things are needed. It's not just about removals. And when working with the SBTI, our clear call here is, can we have neutralisation milestones on that pathway to net zero? At the moment, you have this net zero target date where you can neutralise your residual emissions 5 to 10%. With permanent removals, we're looking for signals along that pathway so that we can scale this sector this decade and do the learning by doing and bring down the costs. That's something we'll be working with SBTI and others on over the next year or so. And then in terms of the EU, we had a question about the EU. One of my favourite compliance schemes, worked on this compliance scheme for around 20 years. And Stephanie knows what I'm going to say now. I'm looking for a removals project who would like to opt in to the ETS. Article 24A means member states can opt in activities to the ETS. We don't have to wait for a revision. And it's been done with other sectors before, like the waste sector has been opted in various countries. But we do also know that the EU has an obligation to look at the role of negative emissions under the EU ETS by mid-2026. It's not definitely going to say there's going to be legislation, but there's an intent to look at how that might work. And I think, Stephanie's paper here with the different options and the discussion on the European Carbon Bank are important. And as we all know, at the same time, the EU is developing its carbon removal, carbon farming framework, which is very much focused on the methodologies, how will and they use different language than I'm used to, how will projects be verified, it's called certification bodies, how will credits be issued, certification schemes, and how the registry will run. So they're building the market infrastructure. We don't know how those credits will be used yet, but that could be a precursor to looking at how you put removals under the ETS. But what's exciting about what we're doing now is we are redesigning, some have already been done, but we're redesigning emissions trading systems for net zero emissions, not just zero emissions, and that's the opportunity that we have.
Thanks. I won't comment on the EU regulations, but on engineered removals, our new government is considering and looking into some options around that, but it's very early days on that. It's also important to understand New Zealand's energy portfolio. We're about 90% renewable energy. We're quite blessed with good hydro, solar, geothermal, and wind resources, and we're investing in those technologies. But where we're also looking is on more nature-based solutions, and while forestry has been a successful opportunity for us, we're also looking at where we could go with like re-wetting wetlands and thinking about even some of the coastal marine area where we could perhaps see some opportunities there. On ETS linking, New Zealand's ETS is currently only a domestic scheme. We had quite a bad experience about 10 years ago when we did link internationally. We were flooded with poor quality Ukrainian and Russian units that really tanked the price of our market, and we had to close and move those out. Just on the question of permanence, it's something that comes up in New Zealand quite a bit too. You know, because you say permanent's 100, and everyone goes, "That's not permanent." And there's, you know, so I'll take the cake though. Our permanence starts at 50, and it's for good reason too, because and this is in our permanent forest category, which is, it's not necessarily for us to lock in the land use choices of future generations. And in a New Zealand context, we have a treaty partnership with our indigenous population, the Maori, and we have legislative requirements to look after future generations and to provide them with opportunities for them to make their own decisions. So you can join our permanent forest category on an initial 50-year basis, and then you renew on 20-year bases. Of course, the same rules, judging that they're still around in 70 years, I won't know, but the rules of the game are, if you deforest, you remove yourself from the ETS, it's a full surrender of all the units. So forestry in New Zealand is a very serious commercial decision to be making, because the ability to switch out of land use is challenging at the end, so you really have to think carefully around your forestry decisions. Thanks.
So just for clarity, even after 50 years, if it is deforested, they still have to surrender?
If you exit the scheme, it's a full, that's how the rules are set right now. Okay. If you've deforested, you surrender all your units. Fantastic. Even if you kept it in forestry but just said you didn't want to be in the ETS, units come back. So,
thank you for the clarification. Mark, we're now officially over time, so you get the final words. Okay,
and I also didn't bring a pen, so I'm going to try to capture everything without notes, and apologies if I'm missing something, but you hit the concept right. You know, historically, 8% limit in California, 4% currently. It's really the reason to have the compliance offsets in the program is cost containment. The purpose of the cap and trade program at large is reducing emissions at the covered sources, right? So there's the compromise there. Certainly there's that criticism of buying emission reductions elsewhere. And so that was just the compromise number that was arrived at. In terms of types, for compliance offset credits, the only ones that really represent removals are with forestry. Again, we also have credits that represent emission reductions due to destroying mine methane, destroying dairy methane, and destroying ozone-depleting substances. Those don't come with that permanence requirement like the forestry buffer solution for insurance does. And in terms of location, projects can, again, voluntarily opt into the program, become subject to requirements of the program, but all of the projects are in sectors that are not covered by the cap and trade program. They voluntarily opt in. They can be anywhere within the United States, so that and that's really for enforceability purposes. So we do have forest projects really throughout the Southeast, Midwest, Northeast. We've got ozone-depleting substances projects in various locations in the South and Midwest as well. Regarding the buffer account insurance mechanism, we do fund that every time we issue credits to an offset project. I mentioned that, 80% of the 262 million, so that's, somewhere around 210 million have been issued to forest credits over the history of the program, and about 33 million of those have been placed in the buffer account. One risk we have is climate change is changing the risk of wildfires. And so we're actually in the process of updating our approach to assessing wildfire risk and pest risk so that we can make sure that that insurance account has full integrity. But to date, we have seen 6 million of those 33 million credits that are in the buffer account be used to account for unintentional reversals due to wildfires. We've had some enormous wildfires in the past 3 to 4 years, so and that constitutes the bulk of that use. But we are reassessing that to ensure that going forward, there's integrity and robustness for the insurance mechanism. There's a nice graph on our webpage that shows the growth and contributions, and each time we withdraw from that to account for a fire, it's accounted in the graph too. And I feel like I might be missing one other piece, but
I think one interesting piece is the issue of engineered versus nature-based, especially in the context of the price differential between the two as well.
Yeah, and I think early on, you know, we have the 6 adopted protocols that define the types of projects that could be included in the program. Those were adopted more than a decade ago. I don't think kind of the removal mechanism like direct air capture or other removals were really on the radar as being potentially cost effective at that time. Certainly, where we are now, there's provisions in our program to looking towards mechanical removals as potential options, but the next key step would be having a protocol, quantification mechanism, verification methods that could be adopted by our board for inclusion in the program. Certainly on the table going forward, but not something that has been done yet.
Thank you, Mark. So I shall not keep you guys or myself, I'm also hungry, from lunch. If I can attempt at any summary, I would say this is, I think, a discussion that we will have more and more. It becomes more and more relevant as we approach net zero, potentially as emission trading system prices go up and pressure comes to attempt to control or moderate those prices, but trying to do so with environmental integrity and without undermining abatement action in our systems. So please join me in a round of applause, and thank you very much for coming.